The Caretaker tapes. Few knew her name. Fewer still knew her story. Leah Mizrahi, a quiet Sephardic woman in her 60s, had spent 12 years behind the heavy iron gates of a house that history would never forget. The Netanyahu residence in Caesarea. To the world, Benjamin Netanyahu was a prime minister, a statesman, a hawk in the ever-simmering cauldron of the Middle East. But to Leah, he was a ghost that haunted her every waking hour. Not because of what he did to the world, but because of what he did behind closed doors. She had not intended to become a whistleblower. In the beginning, the recordings were for her own protection. Tiny devices hidden in potted plants, behind picture frames, sewn into the hem of her uniform. At first, they captured the occasional verbal lashing. Netanyahu belittling her, degrading her, speaking to her like she was less than human. But over time, as she cleaned rooms while he spoke on secure phones, passed unnoticed through the corridors as his allies discussed strategies, Leah realized she was bearing witness to something far more insidious. A man engineering chaos. The first significant tape came in 2015. It was late, past midnight. Leah had been folding laundry outside the guest room when she heard Netanyahu pacing, ranting to someone on a secure call. "Europe is weak," he had said. "If we want permanent destabilization, we need to escalate refugee flows, keep their hands full. Syria is our gift. Chaos there means control here." The call lasted 22 minutes. 22 minutes that would haunt Leah for the next 10 years. She labeled the file, Opus 1. She told no one. Not yet. She was afraid, not just of retaliation, but of the futility of speaking out. Who would believe her? An aging immigrant caregiver versus one of the most powerful men in the world. But she continued recording. Netanyahu had a habit of forgetting she was in the room, or worse, treating her as furniture. He would speak freely, venting to his inner circle, not realizing that every cruel word, every incendiary plan, was being captured. "America is easy to manipulate," he said once. "They crave moral clarity. Give them a cartoon villain, and they'll bomb a nation into dust. Just give them the villain. We create him." Leah watched as world events began to align disturbingly with the content of her tapes. Military operations, strategic leaks, assassinations cloaked in counterterrorism. These weren't idle boasts. These were blueprints, and each time a tape proved prophetic, the burden grew heavier. By 2023, her health was deteriorating. The psychological weight of carrying a decade's worth of global corruption in her pocket was too much. She collapsed in her apartment from what doctors described as a nervous breakdown. When she awoke in a hospital bed, with a single nurse holding her hand, she knew she could no longer carry this burden alone. Through encrypted channels and cautious intermediaries, she contacted a coalition of human rights lawyers known for their work in war crimes and whistleblower protection. At first, they were skeptical. But once she sent them Opus 1, everything changed. The lawyers arranged to meet her in Thessaloniki. There, in a quiet safe house lit by a single lamp, Leah unspooled what would become known as the Caretaker tapes. Over 400 hours of date-stamped audio. Conversations revealing political manipulations, plans to incite religious violence, coordination with defense contractors, bribery of foreign officials. It was, as one lawyer put it, the skeleton key to modern chaos. The recordings were handed to the International Criminal Court in The Hague in late 2024. Netanyahu dismissed the entire archive as a deepfake operation by hostile actors. But forensic analysis validated the recordings. Independent experts authenticated voices, background noises, and metadata. Even Israeli security insiders, off the record, admitted the voice was unmistakably his. The ICC issued a formal indictment against Benjamin Netanyahu for crimes against humanity, psychological abuse, and conspiracy to incite global conflict. It was the first time a Western-aligned leader had faced such charges at this scale. The media reaction was volcanic. Protesters flooded Tel Aviv, New York, Paris, some in support of Leah, others denouncing her as a traitor. In every language, her name became both shield and spear. The tapes revealed a terrifying clarity. Netanyahu and his advisers speaking not just of security, but of the necessity of perpetual conflict to preserve Israeli influence, of manipulating American elections through data firms, of pressuring journalists through legal threats and blackmail, of creating enemies, then selling the world the weapons to fight them. In one particularly damning recording, Netanyahu is heard telling a European defense minister, "Let them burn. Arab, Jew, it doesn't matter. As long as they fear us, they'll obey. I don't want peace. Peace is the death of relevance."
When that recording was played in open court, the reaction was a stunned global silence. Not outrage, not disbelief, just the quiet horror of recognition. And yet, Leah did not seek revenge. She refused to testify in person. She insisted on remaining in Greece, surrounded by plants and silence. In a rare statement issued through her lawyers, she said, "I do not want fame, I want accountability. If justice lives only in the headlines, it is not justice." The ICC proceedings sparked a chain reaction. Allied governments began internal investigations. Lobbying firms shut down overnight. Secret funding trails were exposed in Panama, Zurich, Dubai. Former intelligence agents testified anonymously. Several sitting senators in the US faced inquiries. International media dubbed it the Caretaker case. But it was more than a case. It was a reckoning. It forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth that manipulation had become a language of governance, and one woman with a hidden recorder had exposed its grammar. By 2025, Israel plunged into a constitutional crisis. Netanyahu was placed under house arrest, facing trial. His coalition fractured. The Likud party splintered. Thousands marched for reform, others demanded civil war. In this chaos, a new generation emerged. Young Israelis, Palestinians, Syrians, Iranians, all citing the Caretaker tapes as their awakening. They built forums, journals, movements. Some even tattooed Leah's initials on their wrists, a symbol of bearing witness. A group of international journalists from The Guardian, Haaretz, Der Spiegel formed a joint investigative network. They called it Operation Daylight. Together, using Leah's archive as a foundation, they uncovered other hidden networks: arms deals, media bribes, planned coups in Africa and Latin America. The ripple effects threatened to overturn decades of diplomatic alignments. One decrypted file, previously thought corrupted, revealed a transcript between Netanyahu and a former US Secretary of Defense. "We create crises because peace is unprofitable. And when it all burns, then we build again, on ashes." The statement became infamous, quoted in protests, inscribed on city walls, studied in political science courses. It was dubbed the Fire Doctrine. By early 2026, the United Nations created a new tribunal, the Council for Ethical Governance, with a mandate to investigate systemic disinformation and engineered conflict. For the first time, psychological manipulation and manufactured fear were legally codified as crimes. Leah was offered honours, awards, even a seat on the council. She declined them all. Instead, she wrote a single op-ed published worldwide. "I am not here to lead. I am here to remind you, even shadows leave traces." In Thessaloniki, with quiet funding from unnamed donors, a building was opened, the Museum of Silence, a space dedicated to whistleblowers, journalists, victims of state abuse. Its first exhibit, Leah's uniform, neatly pressed, and the device sewn into its hem. Visitors wept, students wrote essays, survivors brought flowers. And far from courts, crowds, or cameras, Leah tended to a small garden in the hills above the Aegean. She planted trees named after silenced voices, a Kurdish poet, a Saudi blogger, an Israeli refusenik. She spoke to no press, gave no interviews. She simply lived, in quiet, in defiance. And every year, on the anniversary of Opus 1, a letter would arrive, anonymous. Always the same message. You reminded us that truth is not volume, it is vibration, and it moves through everything. But one year, a second envelope arrived. It was unmarked. Inside was a thumb drive and a note. You were not the only one. On the drive were hundreds of hours of recordings, not from Netanyahu's home, but from boardrooms, military bases, diplomatic summits. Voices familiar and strange. The chaos, it seemed, was not his alone. Leah passed the drive to Operation Daylight, and the work began anew. The Caretaker tapes did not end with a conviction, they ended with an awakening, a fracture in history that let the light in, a whispered rebellion. Because even in the most fortified rooms, someone is always listening, and this time they recorded everything. Epilogue, the second archive. The revelations from the second thumb drive expanded the scope of the Caretaker tapes beyond a single man or nation. The recordings revealed high-level conversations implicating officials from multiple countries: France, the UK, Russia, China, even members of international NGOs. One recording captured a NATO strategist discussing population control through resource hoarding. Another featured a Russian diplomat proposing a staged border conflict to spike arms sales.
Suddenly, the myth of a single villain collapsed. Instead, what emerged was a chorus of coordination. Not conspiracy in the shadows, but orchestration in plain sight. The ICC responded by expanding its investigations, partnering with academic institutions to build a timeline of coordinated crises and their profiteers. Whistleblowers came out of hiding, emboldened by Leah's quiet defiance. A former UN interpreter, a disillusioned CIA analyst, a Swiss banker. Each brought pieces of the same puzzle. By late 2026, the Council for Ethical Governance created a global database, the Ledger of Harm. It was open source, encrypted, and constantly updated. Citizens could trace the fingerprints behind economic collapses, media scandals, insurgencies, all backed by evidence from the new tapes. Leah remained silent. Her health was fading. But one morning in 2027, she was found sitting in her garden, a letter clutched in her hand. It read, "You were the first echo, but not the last." When she passed, no state funeral was held. No headlines screamed her name. But in cities across the globe, candles lit windowsills. Whistleblowers left audio cassettes outside courthouses. And in Thessaloniki, a child visited the Museum of Silence and asked, "Can truth really come from someone so small?" The docent replied, "It always does." And the archive continued to grow.